We have this tank top that's a little bit too wide in the neck. We've marked up the shoulders, and then we've also taken in this V-neck here. What you would do normally is take out this stitching and kind of recreate the factory seams, but we're actually going to do just a shortcut version. So what you do is you leave it pinned how you marked it on the person, and then you go in here, inside here, and you take your chalk and you mark where the pins are. That tells you how much you need. You basically want to make sure you get both sides when you mark it, so you know exactly where, when you take the pins out. See, you can't see my mark. It's right here, so I gotta go there. So that tells you how much you need to take out. And then we'll do the same thing on the other one. Kind of find the pin and mark where the pin is, both sides. Okay, and then you're actually going to fold it where this seam is, right here, exactly where the seam is. And sometimes these don't stack up, so you kind of have to split the difference. So we are going to line up this edge here, which is the shoulder, the outside of the arm there. And we're going to put a pin this direction, and that helps it so that this doesn't shift from being lined up, because right now it is lined up the way we have it pinned. And we're going to do the inside of the neck, keeping this seam nice and smooth. You want to line that up. See, my markings are not exactly, so we're actually going to have to split the difference here. So I'll have to go back and remark. So this one, I would just kind of go in the middle and mark right there. For that way we're going to get an accurate. This one is pretty stacked, so we're going to probably leave that one there. So you have those two markings, and then you take your ruler and you join them just across, and that's the line you sew on. And you're going to do that same thing on the other shoulder. Find the actual seam, fold it exactly where the seam is. Make sure you're not twisting anything. Actual seam, and then you look for those markings, and then you stack your edge of your garment here, and then same thing on the other side. See how the back of the garment is slightly wider? You sort of want to just, since this is a knit, you kind of just meet it. You pull the front out a little bit wider to meet the back. And you want to put your pins in this direction so that it keeps your fabric from shifting like this while you're stitching, and then you're actually going to keep these lined up like you have them. So it doesn't matter which way the head of the pin goes, as long as the pin is going with the seam, not perpendicular. So then we're going to check our markings. Okay. I also like to double check to make sure, since this person is not a lopsided, like one shoulder higher than the other, I want to double check and make sure that this is the same amount on both sides here. So this looks like 3/4 of an inch, 7/8 of an inch. So then we're going to go right here and make sure that that's our line also. We want to use our ruler when we do these. Got to just make my mark a little darker there, because it's very easy to not draw a straight line, and then you won't sew a straight line, and then it'll look funny when it's done. So we're going to stitch those two, and then we'll get to this V-neck. So same thing, we're going to hold it and then mark it where the pin is. Make sure you got both sides. And then that tells us how far we need to take it out. So we're gonna just fold it right on this dart here. Nice and smooth, line up the edges. Okay, looks like our mark is stacked. So on this one, we're actually gonna taper this way into this V so that it doesn't do anything funny when it's turned right side out. So see this dart right here, we're actually gonna mimic that and just start here and go further back, so a longer dart basically. But we really want these top edges to line up. So that way when you unfold it, there's no step from one side to the other. It looks just like a nice V. So we're actually going to probably take this dart slightly past the ribbing here and into the shirt. So we want to make sure it's folded exactly smooth here. Fold it in half, center front, nice and smooth. And then you're going to take your ruler and we're going to taper from where we want it to be down into where we're going to taper off. And we're actually going to go slightly past that ribbed edge. So now we're going to stitch our shirt here at our shoulder seams and our center front. I've got my needle is a stretch needle. You could use a ballpoint needle for this type of fabric. This is jersey knit. But I've also got this, it's thread that's made for stretch fabrics. So it just has a little bit more stretch to it than your basic all-purpose thread. Here's what the spool looks like. And it just has a little bit more stretch. Mara Flex it's called. And I just like that because, you know, if you've ever put on a t-shirt or something and you hear the stitches pop, that's kind of frustrating. So this kind of helps eliminate that problem to an extent. So I'm going to get my bobbin ready here. And when we work with knits, we really want to do a slightly longer stitch length than when we work with woven fabric. So I'll probably make my machine stitch length at about a 3. Make sure and start with your bobbin thread on top of your stitch plate. Let's do this V-neck while we're thinking about it. So we're just going to make a dart. That's all this is. We're going to actually start up here though, so that we make sure that to keep those lines nice and level. So we're actually going to start slightly further in and then make sure your needle is in the fabric before you start with your foot pedal. Okay, and now that I know my needle is in and my top edge of my fabric is going to be lined up, I'm going to take out my pin, because if you hit a pin when you're working with a stretch fabric or a knit, it's going to snag the fabric and then it's going to run. So you'll have a hole in no time. Okay, so forgot to lengthen my stitch. Just go back and forth, a little bit of a secure there, and then we're going to taper off right there. And then we're going to go back. Okay. So that's the new front. So it shouldn't be as low cut now. And actually, when I have this much, rather than cut it off, I actually like to smash this dart open. I'm going to take out the old dart. And then I just stitch in the ditch through the layers so that the dart doesn't come out, but it lays nice and flat. Stitch in the ditch is kind of a funny phrase, but it's actually kind of literal naming if you think about it. So I'll show you what that looks like. Get these stitches out here. This should just open up. Okay. And then you basically just flatten this before. Flatten. Okay. And once you flatten it, you're going to flip it over. My extra threads. going to flip it over, and we're going to actually kind of hold this open a little bit more than we need to. And we're actually going to put our needle right here, and it's going to travel in between our stitches. So you actually won't see our stitching, but it's actually going to hold this down so it's nice and flat. And then that creates less bulk in the front there. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so remember, this line in my presser foot is where my needle at center is. So I'm just going to line that up with my seam here. So this line in my presser foot right here is actually where my needle is when my needle is in the center. So I'm just going to line up this seam right here from the dart I just made with this line. And I'm actually going to go a little bit further. I'm not going to start right on the edge. I'm going to go just a little bit back so my feed dogs have something to grab onto. I'm actually going to pull my seam open just a little bit to give my needle a chance to just get in between. We just want right inside. This is the ditch right here. This seam is our ditch, and we're going to literally stitch right in here. Needle down before you start. Just do a little reverse, and you want to make sure that you are holding this open slightly. And then once you're done, our stitches are inside the ditch. But then when it relaxes and goes back to normal, you can't see the stitches. That's another reason why you trim your tails, because the only reason you would have known that I stitched in the ditch was my tail sticking out. And that makes this nice and flat here on the back side, so it's more comfortable to wear, but it also doesn't kind of create bulk that doesn't need to be there. Okay, so that's stitching in the ditch. Now we're going to do these shoulder seams. We've already drawn our lines, so we're literally just going to stitch right on our lines. Make sure that your top line there of your binding is lined up. Needle down, move your pin, and go. Make sure to reverse. Okay, this, you don't really want to take out your pin because that might mean that this is gonna not stay stacked up like you want it. So you just kind of have to be careful here. Okay, now you can take out your pin. Now do you see I kind of made a little pucker here, which is not what I want, so I'm going to actually have to take out that stitch. It's hard to see on black, but the fabric kind of overlaps just slightly, which we don't like. And then maybe it's easier to see on this side, that pucker is doing this. And then when the person wears it, it looks like we did some sort of a funky dart thing that we didn't mean to do. So we need to pop that stitch with our seam ripper and just go over that one spot again, not the entire seam. You want to make sure you're only grabbing the stitch and not the fabric here. Because again, if you snag your knit fabric, it will run, and not in a good way. Sometimes you can see on the other side better. There, see, now I took out a stitch. Now I've got a little bit bigger one to, okay, so I've got that little pucker out. Trim my thread here, and now when I go back over it, I need to just stretch slightly my fabric as I stitch. If you have to overstretch your fabric, then we need to do some other adjustments. but this is not much of a stretch, so this will be fine. And then this is still lined up from before, so we're not going to mess with that. We're just going to taper into it. See it in our, now that pucker is gone. If this was a child's shirt, and I thought maybe they would grow, I would probably leave this seam allowance here. And I would probably just fold it to the back, toward the back of the shirt. And then I would just top stitch here and here to keep that out of the way so it's not kind of sneaking out while it's being worn. But since this is an adult that I'm pretty sure is done getting taller, sorry Sarah, we're going to actually serge this off, and I'll show you how to do that. But we're going to make sure that this other side is the same first. We have to do this other. Okay, so a little bit under our presser foot. Make sure our ribbing trim here is lined up. Needle down. Okay, move our pin. Now we're going to stretch slightly while we stitch. Keep this lined up. I don't think we have a pucker this time. Okay. So now what we want to do, don't serge off the other seam allowance until you've decided that these are both equal. Hold the shirt up by its shoulder seams here, oops, inside out. Hold it up by the shoulder seams. Make sure that you've got your underarms here lined up nicely. You don't want to pull out of shape, and then you just smooth it, and I think it's good now. We have our stitch ready. And since this one actually that I didn't do deep enough before isn't on the other side, I can just leave that there. I don't have to remove those stitches. And then we're going to go, we're actually going to serge. The knife is going to go about here and cut this extra fabric off, and then that will be a lot more comfortable to wear. So I've actually got that stretch thread on my serger too, which I really love. This is a lot softer to wear, and it does have a little bit more stretch than your typical serger thread. So all we're going to do is, if we line up our seam that we made with this line on our presser foot, then the knife is going to go about here and cut off this edge, but leave our stitches. So I'm actually going to go a little bit wider here. Okay. And then you want to leave a tail, so we can tuck that in later. So leave a tail. Then you do the same thing to the other shoulder seam. And leave a tail. And you always want to leave a tail when you're done stitching with the serger. That way it stays threaded. So 2 or 3 inches is ideal for that chain. Okay, and I don't know what this did here. So we're gonna trim. We always want to favor the back of the garment when we're pushing our seam allowances out of the way. So here's the back right here. So we're actually gonna fold our seam allowance toward the back. Okay. And then we're actually gonna take these 2 tails, kind of fold them in like arms. Fold them in first. And then you're just going to lay down that seam allowance. And then we're going to flip it over. And we're actually going to stitch in the ditch here and here. And then we're going to go this direction right over the top stitching, so it kind of masks our work. And you really just want to make sure that the edge of the serging is not beyond the edge of the shoulder seam here. So first we're going to stitch in the ditch. Again, you kind of want to pull open that seam just a little bit as you work, and you just go. Okay, and then while my needle's here, I'm actually going to turn and go this way. And see this top stitching? I'm just going to go right on top of that. And I'll do the other side here. Just make sure, whoops, make sure that your tail is tucked in there still. And if I don't like it, yeah. So I'm going to actually trim these, of course, because now my tails are too long, and I knew that, but I'd rather have them too long so I can work with them first and then trim them. Here's the back of the shirt. So we're going to tuck in our tails like arms, cross the arms, and then fold down the seam allowance. Hold it carefully. You can pin it if you want. And then you just want to make sure that your tails are staying inside your trim. We're going to stitch in the ditch. Make sure that your tail is hidden by your binding there. And just stitch in the ditch. Then we're actually going to turn and follow our top stitching toward the back. Okay, and then do this one. So you shouldn't see the tails. We're going to press it lightly. If you press too hard with too much steam and heat, it'll kind of make the polyester blend part of this fabric, it'll shine, it'll melt that part and it'll shine. So you don't want to do too much heat and pressure, but you do want to make your seams nice and finished. So it looks like that on the inside, and it looks like that on the outside.